Hello, everybody. My name is Holger Schünemann, and it's a really great pleasure to welcome you to this session. This session is entitled Clinical Guidelines and HTA, Aligning Methods and Objectives for Better Evidence-Informed Decision-Making. And the whole session is entitled Theory of Everything. I'll give it a few minutes as people are still continuing to join, and therefore it's probably good. I see a lot of participants, and what I will say at the very beginning is actually quite important, so that it's best to actually wait. Okay. All right. I'm speaking to you from McMaster University in Hamilton, Canada, and again, still a few people joining. So I'll give it just a second, okay, before we continue on. All right. So today's session is, as I said, entitled Clinical Guidelines and HTA. We have 30 participants here, and I will start with a couple of disclosures. The first disclosure is that this session was supposed to be run a little bit differently. I will take responsibility for that, but somebody else was organizing it, and I was supposed to be a presenter. And as it turns out, it would have been best as a workshop. But I'm sure that it will be great fun working with you all through what I have to present and what is the work really of a large group. But before I do that, as I said, I call in from Hamilton, McMaster University. These are my disclosures for today that are relevant. I don't have any direct financial conflicts of interest here. I'm co-chair of the GRADE working group. That's quite relevant because I'll talk a bit about GRADE. I'm director of Cochrane Canada, and I'm on the board of the Guidelines International Network, which is obviously this wonderful organization that has put this event together. I will be speaking about work that we've been doing with the World Health Organization, and we've received research grants and fees from WHO. However, the views expressed here are my own, and there's no payment for this actual presentation. I'll start with mentioning really the many contributors that have participated in this work that I will be presenting, and in particular the colleagues who are listed first here: Marge Reinab, Thomas Piggott, Erki Leidme, Christina Köhler, and who is listed last here, Lorenzo Moya, have supported the preparation of this work, which is the result, as you will learn, which is the result of a workshop that was organized by the WHO Euro, the WHO Estonia Country Office, and the Estonian Health Insurance Fund. And as I said, it's a bit more a workshop than a panel discussion. So you will have seen in the actual chat, in the actual question section, a tab, sentence that asks you to, when you enter the room, to open a second tab in your browser. So that is really important, as we will be doing some interactive work together. So please do open an additional tab in your browser, and we'll go through that. As I said, there are apologies from the co-presenters for today, but as I said, should be great. I'll take you through a description of decision-making contexts in healthcare and speak about the overlap of guidelines with health technology assessment and other disciplines. I have a few questions for you around that. And I'll present a framework for thinking and working together among those disciplines, but really across disciplines in healthcare altogether. And then finally, I will start with an example, or provide you with an example that I think will make a lot of things much clearer that I'm actually referring to here. Okay, good. The objectives for today are that by the end of this session, participants will have an understanding of the different health decision criteria that are utilized across disciplines and how a unifying theory may actually help with making informed decisions in health. And just to provide a little bit of background of how many of us are actually looking at this, decision-making in health is a complex item, obviously, or a complex issue. It typically is the result of balancing options that you have to address a particular question, and the consequences that follow from using or implementing these options, which may be a therapeutic intervention, maybe a diagnostic test, or similar type of management options. And many of you will have seen this particular slide before. There's many factors that influence a decision, but the key question for health technology assessment, for instance, is whether or not the benefits outweigh the harm. And this is probably very, very similar when we develop guidelines or make other types of health decisions. So the questions to ask when we make decisions in this context of balancing options and consequences, thinking about benefits and harms, however, are a bit broader. So beyond that question of whether or not the expected health benefits are greater than the harms or vice versa, which includes issues around priorities, baseline risk, intervention effects, some values that people place on the outcomes. Beyond that, the decision makers, in particular in the context of health technology assessment, but often in guidelines as well, think about the magnitude of the resource requirements, which may be then further evaluated through cost effectiveness analysis. The other type of factors that are relevant in many decision-making contexts include issues such as whether or not the intervention leads to an equitable outcomes across the target populations. That also includes what societal implications may be and what the environmental impact of an intervention might be. And then, in addition to that, we think about whether or not interventions are acceptable to different stakeholders, and whether or not they are feasible. And this may often include issues such as social considerations, legal considerations, or political considerations. So I'll come to my first item here that I would like you to participate in, and I will very quickly go to a separate browser, and you should all have in the link actually the following. I will share this with you. That way you can all see that. When you enter the room, as I said, open a tab in your browser and then copy and paste the Slido link that will now appear on your screen. I will put that Slido link right here, and then you can actually start looking at the first question that I have for you. Again, you need to open a separate browser and then copy and paste the Slido link that appears for you here. Now it should be somewhere here on your Q&A. Copy and paste that Slido link. and you will see a okay, all right. So you will appear, it will appear there, and I will actually start my first question. Okay, so you should be seeing something like this. And my question to you is, are you primarily a guideline developer, someone working in HTA, or in another discipline? And I would say I'm primarily a guideline developer. And that's what most of you are saying. So again, copy, open a tab, and you tap in your browser, and I'm really interested in where you're from. Okay, a few of you are others. We have very few HTA people here today. Okay, so all right, and that's very good. In case that you have any trouble, I'm looking here. Okay, there is one person. Okay, no, I think it all looks great. Discussion forum, great, okay. This is what we got. So most of you have been able to answer, and we have guideline developers for the most part, which helps me quite a bit in tailoring the rest of my presentation here. Let me go back to where we were. All right, so about 22 people participated, and 90% were guideline developers. So let me start with talking about the different actors in the health decision-making field. And I obviously will pick HTA as one example. There's a working group that is called the GIN-NATA. It's the GIN and International the International Network of Health Technology Assessment Units working group that tries to work together in order to bring HTA closer to guideline development. And health technology assessment agencies typically use explicit methods to determine the value of a health technology at different points in a life cycle. The purpose is to inform decision-making in order to promote an equitable, efficient, and high-quality health system. HTA supports coverage decisions, reimbursement decisions, and other types of decisions. So for instance, technology management, technology referring to pharmaceuticals or other types, devices, other types of interventions, optimization, health system organization, and service delivery. And many organizations, including the Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technology in Health, in the UK, NICE, HTA in Thailand, Conitec in Brazil, INEAS in Tunisia, and networks like the European Network of Health Technology Agencies support the assessment of health technologies using a different set of various criteria that typically consider health effects, cost, and other decision criteria. All right. Guidelines. So for this particular audience, I don't think I have to say very much about guidelines, but the typical definition, or one of the definitions that we always use is systematically developed evidence-based statements that assist providers, patients, policymakers, and other stakeholders to make informed decisions on healthcare and public health policy. Lots of different standards, obviously published, IOM, GIN, and so on. For us, quite relevant in this context is the evidence to decision frameworks that have been developed by the GREAT working group that reflect or are an approach to a structured decision-making process with criteria to evaluate health interventions. Other disciplines that are quite relevant in this context and that you could think of in health decision-making, and you will see over the presentation and over this webinar how relevant it actually is. Other players or actors in this field could be, for instance, regulators. They make decisions. Regulators for drugs and medical devices actually play an important role in the review of evidence in advance of an approval for instance, a medical treatment. Regulatory agencies include, for example, the US Food and Drug Administration, the European Medicines Agency, but countries, many countries, obviously, or basically all countries have their own regulatory agencies. And they require drug and device manufacturers to submit evidence from investigational treatments to for a preclinical review, to a clinical review, and then final drug approval for manufacturing and use in the jurisdiction they're responsible for. And I'll give you another example of two other examples who's actually involved in this field of health decision-making, systematic reviews. I will not spend much time on it. Most of you will be familiar with it, play this very critical role in the decision-making process. They have been around for over 40 years in principles, coming primarily from the psychological discipline of the psychological sciences. Cochrane plays an important role. Systematic review begins with a predefined protocol, which then obviously leads to answering specific questions. And I'll expand on that a little bit as well. And then finally, as another example where decisions about interventions are made, we picked the essential medicines. So one of the people who made a big contribution to this work that I'm presenting here is Lorenzo Moya, who is heading the work that underpins the selection of essential medicines at WHO right now. Essential medicines are defined as those that satisfy the priority healthcare needs of the population. The model list of essential medicines, which is produced by WHO since 1977, prioritizes medicines identifying the most effective therapeutic options in a disease area, represents the bare bones of what a responsible health system should provide access to, and is intended to serve as a country's basis for the selection, procurement, supply of medicine, reimbursement schemes, medicinal donations, and in the development of, as I said, national lists. So most countries have an adapted version of the, or many countries have an adapted version of the WHO model list of essential medicines for the purpose that I described. So looking at all of this, the problem that is obvious from what I showed you here is a few examples of the key actors in making decisions about health, is that clinicians, the public, obviously including patients, policymakers, payers, regulators, and the science community, such as the guideline developers and the HTA scientists, they influence or make decisions. And that is done at various levels by using systematic reviews, health technology assessments, making guideline recommendations, making coverage decisions, selecting essential medicines or diagnostics, and as we will learn, quality actors that work in quality improvement, as well as in policy. So these type of decisions are really made by many different actors and players in the health field. The extent to which these different actors actually use structured processes and transparent criteria differs. And the main problem is that they are very poorly coordinated. I will go to my second question. And having laid out the problem, my question is, what are the biggest roadblocks preventing us from collaborating across disciplines? So I'll continue to ask you to stay in on this slide. You have again, the link is here. And there's a question that I will address while everybody copies the link. So does HTA cover systematic reviews? Therese is asking this. And I would say that HTA utilizes methods of systematic reviews, literature searching, inclusion, exclusion criteria. One way that my HTA colleagues tell me about the difference of HTA and systematic reviews, although I think the main difference is that the decisions that are made are different. that an HTA often looks as, here's an intervention, what can I use it for? The systematic review says, here's the population, and here's the intervention, what are the outcomes? However, I think a much better description is that HTA uses systematic methods to identify research evidence or evidence in order to inform a decision. So I will launch my second question. So the actual next question for you is, what are the potential roadblocks? What are the biggest roadblocks preventing us from collaborating across disciplines? And you can type your answer here, and I will actually see those answers come up. So take a second, take a minute to take a few deep breaths as well, as I've already talked for 15 minutes or so. So you should be able to submit through Slido what the biggest roadblocks are by going to your browser. I see a few answers come here to me. And as the answers come in, I will mention them to you. As usual, there's already great material coming in, and I will share that with you in a second as you are typing your own answers. Yeah, so I'll start reading them. Not trusting each other. I think that's an excellent point, and we always hear that. I'll give you a quick example. When we work with HTA agency, they believe that guidelines are often developed by conflicted parties. Guideline developers often say HTA is influenced by industry because they pose the question. So I think there's an excellent point, not trusting each other. The next is budget and different stakeholders. I think that's absolutely true. HTA agencies often work with very big budgets. Some of these agencies have hundreds of employees. The stakeholders that you deal with, for instance, industry is different in HTA than it is in guidelines. And now I will pull this over because there are really good things coming in from you. So what you see here is some of the other points that are being made. Different health priorities, different health policies, no clear collaboration standards. CPGs are not planned at the outset of capacity building. Differences in terms and concepts, or excellent point. Lack of unity of language. We may mean the same thing, but we write it differently. So these are all, I think, observations that many of us will share. Different methodologies. Is it still, for instance, there are still other relevant societies that do not use great methodology. Of course, yeah. And we work in our own silos. Finally, leadership not willing to collaborate, trust, people attached on nomenclature as opposed to methods. So superb points, I think, that are mentioned by you. And I don't see anything else. Oh, there's one more. On budget, the pair has to balance which intervention they will accommodate in the given budget. Yes, so the budget impact analysis that is often part of HTA or coverage decisions can often be ignored in guidelines. Many guideline panels don't even look at cost effectiveness. Lack of communication and collaboration, excellent. So really some great points coming in. Systematic reviews cover some, but not all populations. Great. Okay, good. This is extremely astute, I would say. So let me tell you what we try to do to address the problems that you actually laid out there. Under the leadership, as I said, of the WHO Euro Office, the WHO country office in Estonia, the Estonian Health Insurance Fund, and the WHO Department of Health Product Policy and Standards. I mentioned a few of these key players that have represented these organizations in the earlier slides. We brought together representatives of these different areas to reconcile how the evidence that influences decisions and the actual decisions relate to each other. Our starting point, and I will not spend much time on this, but our starting point were evidence to decision criteria, and there are obviously many. There is some multi-criteria decision analysis and decision making that we believe basically covers very similar areas. But our starting point were the great evidence to decision criteria that many of you will be very, very familiar with, given that most of you are guideline developers. So the first paper was published in 2016 after we had applied the ETDs, as we call them, for 3 or 4 years in various guidelines to develop and test them. There's lots of publications about them, and you know that how they are used in the grade process is that when there is a clinical question for guideline development or for an HTA, systematic reviews are done, or a health technology assessment, they're synthesized, the certainty of evidence is assessed, and then a panel, by using these evidence to decision frameworks, make recommendations in the context of guidelines. They grade the recommendations, they make recommendations for or against a technology, and they make recommendations that are either strong or conditional, and that typically, as I said, ends up in a particular guideline. And just in terms of background, for those of you who are a little bit less familiar with it, this is how this typically works. There would be a question, a PICO question, evidence to decision framework used, evidence is reviewed and synthesized. A guideline group discusses the evidence. They may add additional relevant considerations and then make judgments about, for instance, the health benefits that we call desirable effects in the context of the ETDs. They make judgments about how large they are using different approaches, which is not really the purpose of my presentation here, using different approaches, and they then typically make judgments that describe whether or not, for instance, the desirable effects are small or large, or the undesirable effects are small or large. And this is done across criteria, and this is just a brief recap. Typically, it has to do with how important the problem is, desirable and undesirable effects. The certainty of the evidence plays a fundamental role in the whole concept of making decisions based on the evidence to decision frameworks. Values, the balance of the effects, resources can be considered, but you will see later on in the presentation how that actually can be tailored to your decision-making context. The certainty that you have about which resources are required, equity considerations, acceptability, feasibility. This is based on appraisal, judgments are made in the guideline context. Again, most of you know that when there are net undesirable consequences, we make recommendations against. When there are net desirable consequences, we make recommendations for an intervention or the intervention of interest. So that's how this typically works. And if we're not as sure as a guideline panel, we make conditional recommendations either for or against a particular option. I'll give you a very quick example that many of the people, including some people here in the participant list, were involved with, where we applied these evidence to decision frameworks probably in a quite sophisticated way. This is the European Commission Initiative on Breast Cancer. And the way that this would typically look then is that a guideline panel makes judgments across different criteria, here displayed in different colors, in order to then say, okay, it looks like all of the desirable consequences outweigh the undesirable consequences, or they do that. We make a recommendation for the intervention. If we're not as sure, we make a conditional recommendation. Okay, that's all pretty obvious. And the interesting thing is that these evidence to decision frameworks not only focus on the criteria that I just described, but they also lay out the question. They lay out what type of conclusions are drawn, which may be the recommendation, but provide a justification for that, and have there's different ways of presenting the information. They allow taking different perspectives, including the health systems and policy perspective, which is particularly relevant for if we start thinking about HTA more, They have been developed for coverage decisions, for policy decisions, and they can be used to facilitate decision making. What many of the users and those who many of the users of the evidence to decision frameworks, or those who are familiar with it, do not really know is that when we develop these evidence to decision frameworks, this is the work that was first authored by Pablo Alonso Coelho, that we actually thought of the criteria that might be relevant for different decision-making processes that go beyond a simple guideline development effort. So I already mentioned coverage decisions. I mentioned recommendations or decisions that are made on the health systems and public health level, and in particular, what might be relevant when you have linked evidence such as looking at tests. So given that, we felt that we were in that given those considerations, we could use these great evidence to decision criteria as a starting point, not as the unifying theory, but as a starting point to see how other disciplines might map onto this. So remember, one of you actually said in the chat, or several said, that different nomenclature, we are stuck in our terms as opposed to thinking about the actual methods for collaboration. We've noticed this with other fields as well, that nomenclature and the way that we use terms is often a roadblock when we talk about very similar concepts. So that's the first point. The other point is that what is also very relevant for any of these decision makers is that we ask different questions. It's not all about, does the intervention actually cause more benefits than harms? And the ETDs are requiring, really, in their optimal use, those who complete them to do systematic reviews for each of the criteria that are actually covered there. So in the guideline context, it's a guideline question, but the evidence review goes far beyond reviewing the intervention effects. It covers issues such as systematic reviews of how much people value outcomes, right? You could do systematic reviews on each of the criteria, as I said, in order to then arrive at a recommendation or coverage decision. Okay, so now we are getting to what we've brought together with this group of authors that I already mentioned, and it's going to be both a mouthful as well as a graphically challenging slide that I will take you through. So considering all of that, with that group, we developed what we call a unifying theory that might help us bring these different groups together. And so here is my key slide for the whole presentation, and we'll go through that, and we'll address the relevant items together. I'll ask a few more questions in the Slido, and we'll have some time to really gather a lot of thoughts from you. It starts with evidence from primary research, represented here. By the way, the graphical design here, so the original framework, I'm always making sure that we give credit to the relevant people. The original framework comes obviously from, draft comes from me, Thomas Pigott, and Margaret Raynapp. But the graphical presentation here has been done by our wonderful Carlos Coelho, who many of you know, who is a close collaborator. He's put our pretty rudimentary graphs into something that looks a little bit more appealing, or I actually think very appealing, and makes the point. So it starts with evidence from primary research. That evidence from primary research is often in early steps used by regulators, so FDA, EMEA, considering health benefits and harms, values and costs, typically, to make a recommendation. You can see my pointer here, the arrow. Actually, what I will do is, bear with me for a second. I think what I can do is I can actually, oops, interesting. So, okay, all right. What I can do is I can actually make this a laser pointer that typically is better seen on screens. So they make recommendations that affect, obviously, those who are the target of an intervention. But that often happens without systematic reviews, although it can include systematic review methods, right? So regulators make decisions. All these other disciplines typically or should rely on a systematic review that summarizes the evidence from primary research, and there is pretty broad agreement that most of these groups follow a population intervention comparators and outcomes framework. So what was mentioned already in the chat is that for HTA, you often consider multiple interventions. That can be done by in a guideline process as well. And really important in this PICO framework to use the plural here, because typically for a health problem, there's multiple interventions or multiple comparators. HTA, in many people's view, uses systematic review methods and considers the problem, benefits and harms, values, costs, certainty of evidence. They often look, as I already said, at social implications, ethical implications, as well as potential legal implications down the line. Guideline developers, as you can see, use these overarching criteria here, but they, using the ETDs as an example, consider criteria such as equity, feasibility, and acceptability. And I already mentioned that these may be just different terms. In the quality improvement field, and there's few people who on this on the participant list here who know a lot about this, but in the quality improvement or quality assurance field, typically those who develop quality indicators or quality assurance schemes also consider these criteria, but they might think about, when they make decisions about what quality indicators to use, things like measurability and issues such as scientific soundness, which I would put forward is very similar to the certainty of evidence that we are talking about here. Coverage decisions, again, similar criteria used. This is all the same, but there may be, again, legislation around the transparency of making coverage decisions. For the essential medicine list, which was one of my examples that I
Sorry, Holger, to interrupt you.
Yeah,
I don't think you're sharing your screen at the moment.
Oh, that is a problem. Okay. Thank you so much for letting me know. Okay. And we will have to come back to that. Okay, thanks so much, Francois, for letting me know. That would have been a big problem, but you now see what I'm getting at. So I spoke about the regulators, spoke about HTAs, spoke about guideline developers and how these criteria are similar: quality improvement, similar criteria, coverage decisions, similar criteria, with a area of decision criteria that is flexible, that differs across these different fields. So I then spoke about the essential medicine list. Also there, in this decision-making process, the criteria that are listed here in green are very similar, but there may be issues such as the regulatory status, again, going back to the regulators, and market availability that lead to decisions. And then for policymaking, here on the very right, also those criteria are very similar, but factors such as equity and feasibility based on some standard text may play a bigger role than in other sections. These disciplines often use modeling to arrive at conclusions, which are a recommendation for HTA and guidelines oftentimes. For other fields, such as quality improvement, coverage decision, and the essential medicines, we believe that these groups typically make decisions for those target groups, and while the policymakers like to speak about options that they lay out about a potential product. These are the users. Obviously, all of these sections relate to implementation, and there will be different implementation strategies, including interventions that can be evaluated that these different actors actually use. All of that can be guided by a legal framework. And I can tell you that amongst this group of authors and contributors to this work, one of the big questions that we had is how much legal frameworks are actually part of this? How much a legal frameworks part of this should be part of this? Should regulators be part of this consideration, or do they have a really different role? So what I will do is, you have this this slide now in your head. I think it's probably imprinted for most for all of you. I will go back to my Slido, and I will share with you the next set of questions. Okay, so next set of questions. This is the theory of everything slide. You will start with a name. You can add your name, or you can just say, I'm not available, or I don't want to give you my name. It's perfectly fine. Okay. All right. So this is the what will happen next. Get ready. All right. Okay. And then I will let many of you, I see 40 people on. So please do let us know if there are any problems. Okay. All right. The figure is not in the Slido. No. This figure is not in the Slido. Yes, sorry about that you couldn't see the slide. Yeah. Okay, good. This was all supported with that. Okay, as you're doing your work, all right. Okay, yes, there's a question that I will answer in the meantime while you are giving it thought, and I will go back to the slide in a second. That way you can think about it. Oh, look what happens here. As you're answering your quiz questions. Okay, good. All right, so good. Some people have registered, and I will start with the first question. First question is, these are the 4 questions that you will be seeing. I already showed them on the slide. I see my discipline represented here. The decision criteria seem to be complete. And what I will do now is I will share that slide again. Briefly checking in what answers we are seeing here. This is an interesting compatibility issue here. Okay, I have 19 answers, and I will stop it here and go to the next, I believe, as people have answered. So it's about 20 of you who have participated, and the frank answer seems to be yes. The decision criteria seem to be complete. Okay, very good. Right. Let's go to the next question that I have for you. Should the legal frameworks be a key component of decision criteria? Okay. And you can answer again, yes, no, or undecided. Let's see what people say. Okay, and in particular, yeah, great. Okay, good. We have more people coming in. So what I'd ask you to do is you can use that wonderful GIN platform in helping me understand why you might say no. They should actually not be part of the decision-making processes. So you can use your live Q&A here, as you know, and tell us why you think this may not be relevant, and we'll discuss it a bit more. Great. Okay. All right. Super. Okay. Good. So as you see here, most of you said legal frameworks should be a key component of the decision criteria, but many of you were either undecided and some of you said no. That's probably about 2 of the 24 counting this up. 4% of you. Okay, good. Let's go to the next one. Okay, let's go to the next one. Are regulators part of the overarching process? Are regulators part of the overarching approach to health decision making? Should they be part of it? Should they be integrated in what I showed here on the actual slide? Should these regulators be integrated in the same way that we might want to integrate across different disciplines? And I will provide some straw answers here and then see what everybody says. People are undecided. And in particular, those who might be less decided or might be undecided, you might want to tell us why that actually is the case in the chat. Excellent. So some of you really believe that regulators, that some of you are really undecided, but most of you, the overarching majority of participants today in this webinar, believe that regulators should be part of the overarching approach. Some of you are undecided. Excellent. Okay. So let's go to my next question. They're called quiz questions. They're really not quiz questions, obviously. Next question is, systematic reviews or statement are an overarching method to deliver best health decisions. So in the way, again, I go back to the slide that you've seen before, is this representation of systematic reviews as an overarching method to inform each of these decision-making actors. Are they an overarching method to inform each of these decision-making actors, or are they something else? That's the question. Okay, and a few of you disagree, and that's really good to know that there is disagreement. So I'll again ask those of you who disagree to help us understand why you might disagree. And then we'll start the conversation around the actual Q&As that are posted there. So I'll just see if there's additional answers. So please go back to your virtual conference portal. Yeah, great. Go back to your virtual conference portal, and you can use the live Q&A here to do post your questions. So I'll start. I'm taking the first question from Therese, sorry. Legal frameworks, do they also cover human rights? So they may cover human rights. However, if we're looking at this particular graph, human rights have been been brought forward by guideline developers at WHO. So human rights issues in the WHO integrate framework that I will talk about a little bit, which is a evidence to decision criteria framework. Human rights are explicitly mentioned. They're explicitly mentioned. For the great evidence to decision frameworks, human rights are maybe covered under acceptability and under equity issues. They may not be exactly the same, we'll get back to that, but they are probably in many instances a criterion for decision making. However, they may be anchored in legal frameworks so that the legal framework would say you must consider human rights in your decision-making process. That's how I would describe that. And Yasser is asking if the aforementioned article, this comes from, I'm not sure what you mean by this. Yasser, you might want to clarify. The two articles that you describe are about quality indicators. The figure is not from that article. The figure has been submitted for submission. It's different. This is the two articles that you are mentioning in the chat focus on quality indicators and decision making and quality in quality making in defining quality indicators. The unifying theme, the theory of everything, is something that we've submitted for publication. Yeah. Okay. What about environmental issues? So Therese again, such as pollution and potential climate effect. So very good. So if you think of again that unifying theory here, or the theory of everything, where do issues such as environmental impact come in? And what is interesting is that there's work ongoing looking at evidence decision criteria for environmental exposures. There's a specific great project group that is actually looking at this. But one way to think about environmental issues is that they come under health benefits and harms. So for instance, my paradigmatic example that I always cite here is that if we are continuing to permit diesel fuel as a main as a main energy source for trucks, then we are willingly accepting the negative consequences, the undesirable health effects of diesel fuel that have been strongly associated with asthma and possibly causing cancer, obviously. But we are accepting the use of diesel fuels despite the negative health consequences, because cities need to be supplied with food so that people have enough to eat, which are the potential benefits on a societal level. So environmental impact and environmental outcomes can be considered in many instances under health benefits and harms if we're thinking about these big policy decisions that are made, for instance, in the environmental context. So it's a great point in question. Okay, great. Tees, I don't want to butcher your name, although I can tell you that I have a lot of experience with butchered names because my name is one of those, like many others. It's not John, that's for sure. I disagree because I believe that combining systematic reviews with real-world data can provide real insight into the possibilities of your patient sitting on the other side of your table. I think systematic reviews alone cannot do that because those represented study populations and those differ from real patients. Okay, thanks for this very insightful comment. You will hear my standard thought on that, and I encourage everybody to participate lively in this chat. But again through the platform. So my first point on real world data is that there is no unreal world. In other words, randomized trials, observational studies, big data are all part of the real world. And the actual term real world data is a real misnomer, because sometimes randomized trials that are done in a narrower context are much more representative than what you might get even from a registry, and vice versa, obviously. They together form the evidence that we have. There is no parallel universe. It's only the real world that is there. That's the first thing. But I know what you're speaking about. You're thinking about observational or big data. My point here is, if you do systematic reviews that consider all relevant data, they can include the type of data that you are referring to. As an example, real patients make decisions. You can do systematic reviews. You can do systematic reviews of what decisions people make. So think of the way that we think of systematic reviews in this context is that it is a method to systematically summarize whatever evidence is out there, be it from real patients or be it from, as you called it, real patients. I completely understand the use of this term, or be it from research evidence that results from randomized trials. So that would be my thinking there. So combining systematic reviews with real world data, I agree if we use these terms that would be the appropriate way of doing this, but I would put forward we should utilize systematic review methods to obtain those data, because a single data set, in this context, a single registry that you might want to use might or might not be the most relevant for decision-making context. And there may be additional registries or big data that one could utilize. Great point, though. I'll see if there are other comments in the chat. As you see here, most people would agree, but point well taken, that systematic reviews do present an overarching method to deliver the best healthcare options. All right, I'll go back to my presentation, and we've addressed the 4 key questions that were labeled as a quiz, but it was obviously not a quiz. So the first issue is, for instance, the ethical considerations were brought up in the context. The first issue is that when we envisioned the evidence to decision framework or criteria, we actually specifically said those are the key criteria that we might think are relevant, but a decision-making body, this addresses Yasser's question to some degree, a decision-making body may use additional criteria that we call custom criteria. So in other words, if you think that you would specifically want to label, because we talked about the issue of the problem around labeling, if you want to specifically label a decision criteria and ethical considerations, then by all means, you can do that. While many of us would think, well, ethical considerations are considered under acceptability and equity. But the point here is that for emphasis purposes, the evidence decision frameworks actually specifically said that you can develop your own custom criteria. You can also develop your own custom answers. Interestingly enough, I kind of anticipated that ethics would come up as one of the potential considerations, ethical considerations or human rights. It was not exactly the same, but you could then develop your own answer options in order to explicitly consider this. And that might help bridge again, or considering different criteria in different disciplines. I mentioned the WHO Integrate framework as one of the examples where, for instance, that is explicitly considered. All right. I'll move on to examples for collaboration, and I will present you with two examples, or I will mention two examples in this particular context. And the first is the selection of outcomes that actually matter, excuse me, that actually matter to people. Again, taking the guideline perspective for bridging across disciplines, many of you will be familiar, the approach that GRADE uses for identifying outcomes that are relevant for a guideline. The process starts with rating potential outcomes as those that are critical for decision-making, that are important but not critical for decision-making, and those that might be of low importance. We use these 1 to 9 scales that many of you will be familiar with. We use these 1 to 9 scales to identify outcomes that in a guideline context might be critical for decision-making, important or of low importance. And this includes desirable outcomes such as survival or prolongation of life, reduction of hospital stay, undesirable outcomes such as increased mortality or side effects. And we typically ask decision makers, in this case guideline panels, to identify no more than 7 outcomes. So this is a process that is fairly widely used, and at the same time, we've experienced that when you start working with guideline panels, it doesn't always work. In other words, we oftentimes see quite a bit of variability in terms of how these outcomes are rated by those who, at the end of the day, influence the decision. And one way of how we thought to address that variability that we see is by standardizing the way that an outcome is described. So one approach that we've taken is to develop health outcome descriptors that are standardized so that this judgment about what health outcome might be critical for decision-making, an outcome that might be important to decision-making, so that we standardize the description of the outcome to achieve better agreement of what might be important and what might not be important. This is from the European initiative, the European Commission initiative on breast cancer as an example, where the outcome false negative screening results was described as in a standardized way, because we realized that these experts in breast cancer epidemiology and screening and so on really differed in both the description as well as how important, for instance, a false negative may be, by then describing in a standardized way in 4 domains what the actual outcome would mean before somebody does a rating of their importance. I'll show this on this slide a little bit better because we did this also for other work and have increasingly used this approach across disciplines. This is from a paper by Wojtek Wilczak that just came out. It's essentially provided a description of the development of over 120 of those for the field of venous thromboembolism, in order to identify what important outcomes and not so important outcomes are. The 4 domains that we include are symptoms, the time horizon of an outcome, what testing and treatment might be associated with it, and what type of consequences might result from suffering or experiencing one of these outcomes. And as you see here, this is just a very brief overview. As you see here, in this way, you can describe the same outcome as presenting as a mild outcome, a moderate or severe outcome, by describing these the domains in greater detail. And again, the purpose here is to avoid that one person, a patient, a person out in the community, or a clinician thinks of this outcome in one way and another person thinks of the outcome in another way. which obviously leads to problems when weighing benefits and harms. If you think of a mild blood clot to your lungs, pulmonary embolism, when you balance benefits with downsides, such as giving anticoagulants and experiencing a bleed, if you think of a mild version of that pulmonary embolism, it's very different from somebody thinking of a severe version and therefore weighing benefits and harms differently. So that standardization is one approach to thinking about it. And our idea was that as one example for where we can start bridging across disciplines is by starting with a description of these outcomes that is standardized. So this is what we've thought of for the past 15 years, these health outcome descriptors that can be utilized across disciplines. And most of you will be familiar with the COMET initiative that has focused on randomized controlled trial outcome standardization. Our thinking is we should be really broader. This is from a paper that we published last year in the Journal of Clinical Epidemiology, and we call it the solar system to outcome development. I'll explain it in a second. I'll explain it more in a second. But the disciplines often have difficulties sharing information, working with each other, because outcomes that are utilized are defined differently, are not utilized in the same way, when in reality, all that matters is whether or not an outcome is people or patient important, right? And these may include patient or people-reported outcomes. That is at the center. We are thinking of often use different definitions of these outcomes and guidelines as opposed to the randomized controlled trials, sometimes also in so-called real-world evidence that was already described. In quality improvement, we talk about outcomes. We use outcomes in systematic reviews. They are maybe different in HTA and so on. When at the same, again, when at the center is really some description that is relevant for the people who are affected by an intervention or who really are the best judge about whether or not, how an outcome actually should be described and how important it is. So these different fields, these different actors really are thinking about the same thing, yet they often use different definitions. And the reason why we called it the solar system, standardized outcomes linking across stakeholders, as a hub and spokes model for thinking about direct core outcome measures in healthcare, is that these different actors, this is not a true representation here, but these different actors oftentimes are very far removed from what matters to people. And if we were to work on a better harmonization, then these different actors wouldn't be as far from the sun. And we would be possibly really have direct outcomes if we were to harmonize across different fields. So again, this is not a true representation. This is an example for how outcomes might be really far from what matters to people when we develop our questions or when we, for instance, think about quality improvement outcomes. And what I'm showing now, Yasser, you identified one of the articles correctly. This is from an article that Elena Carmelli first authored, where we started thinking about this concept of how can we relate quality indicators in this solar concept closer to what matters to people, right? Here's an example. It really starts a healthcare question. If we agree across disciplines, although we mostly have guideline developers here, a healthcare question starts with the PICO question. Outcomes should be measurable, and they should be, as I said, related to what matters to people. What we proposed is that there should be a direct link to what we measure as quality indicators. So for instance, the outcome may be quality of life. The quality indicators should then focus on measuring quality of life. Should be a defined instrument that can then be used as a performance measure. That is, for instance, the SF-36. We can measure generic quality of life when we implement an intervention, and we can set thresholds in the quality improvement field that should be achieved in order for an intervention to be either worthwhile or to measure performance across different implementers of an intervention, as an example. Right? So that would be one way. If you think of quality of life as what matters to people, you could measure quality of life in similar ways for similar questions. Make sure that, for instance, if you agree it's generic quality of life that matters for a particular health question, that the systematic review focuses on generic quality of life, such as the SF-36. The randomized controlled trials, when they are conducted, use these type of instruments. We improve our way that we communicate about generic quality of life tools, that they are utilized in HTA, in guideline recommendations and quality improvement. That's kind of the thinking behind it. So my next question for the Slido is, can you think of other examples where collaboration on methods, processes, or approaches is obvious? Similar to the example about outcome. I apologize for the typo there. I go back to my Slido, and I will start with this particular question. And so the question is, can you think of other examples where collaboration on methods, processes, approaches is obvious, similar to the example that we are actually that I used about outcomes, but where in particular we might not be doing as well? And so as you're thinking about these examples, I will answer a question that has come up. Okay. I'll see what's coming in here. So you can type your answer here. Can you think of other examples where collaboration on methods, processes, or approaches is obvious? So, and what we might want to use in this context. So, patient values and preferences. Okay. I'll put this out for the other chat then, so we're gathering some thoughts here from you. Patient values and preferences. One, give everybody a breathing space. Identify needs for new research. Okay, good. So the research needs, the research conclusions that might come out. Okay, you can obviously use the chat freely as well, the Q&A, the live Q&A section here to provide any further information. Okay, so consider answering the health questions by both clinical practice guidelines and HTA simultaneously in parallel and not in sequence. Measurements of instruments. Okay, that one, you might want to clarify that in the chat. Measurements of instrument. So additional clarification might be great on that one, and then I'll reflect on the patient values and preferences. Start by developing clinical practice guidelines at the beginning and assess new interventions in the same time, and have a combined project. Setting standardized thresholds. Standardized thresholds, I suspect thresholds for, that could be related to exposures, it could be related to the performance indicators that we were just talking about. I'll see if there's more information in the chat, in the live Q&A. Okay, not yet. It's just a reminder that we have about 14 people left. I don't see anything here yet in the chat, but you can submit your additional points. Here, I think patient values and preferences is a criterion that should always be taken into account, no matter which decision process is involved. So, Elena, thanks for that. So, values and preferences really being a critical item. I'll get back to the values and preference issue in just a second. So, other ideas are implementation, setting standardized thresholds, as I already said. I wonder if there are any additional ideas. Otherwise, I will close this now. Have the same priority for treating subject and then better implementation. So implementation, shared decision-making tools. Okay, shared decision-making tools. Those are areas of collaboration that might come up. Again, just a question here. You can add responses here that will pop up on our screen in the live poll. I see if anything else comes up. Nothing else has come up. Okay. For thresholds, I mean clinical significance thresholds for the same outcomes across various for various guidelines. Okay, great point, Usma. That's a wonderful point. Let me elaborate on the two items that were raised, I think, by several people then. So values and preferences, Elena is putting forward that this is a criterion that should always be taken into account. And in fact, if you think about the example that I provided, the importance of the outcome, this is very directly related to patient values. So some of us believe that the importance of an outcome is nothing else but the value that people place on an outcome. Some of us also believe is that people don't have preferences for interventions, but they have different values that they place on the outcomes that are affected by the intervention. So for instance, if you offer for a certain condition a medication or surgery, in our classic thinking, it's about preferences for one option or the other, when in reality, it is about the value that people place on the actual outcomes that are associated with the intervention that make them choose one over the other. And for instance, to give you a very concrete example, again, pain would be caused by surgery, might not be caused by a medication. The reason why people might prefer a medication over surgery is not because it's simple preference, it's actually the value that they place on avoiding pain. And so this was brought up by others as well, values and preferences. I would put forward that values and preferences then are included in what matters to people. So the value that people place on an outcome. But what I see also from your answers is that there seems to be agreement that values are a critical feature here. Okay, good. Then for thresholds, I mean clinical significance thresholds for the same outcome across various guidelines. I think that's an area of collaboration, probably across guidelines, but it might also be something that could be utilized in a decision about essential medicines or in an HTA, for instance, whether or not the reduction of a 0.5% mortality risk is something that is worthwhile if it were the only outcome that was affected. The standardization across these different outcomes, across different guidelines might be very, very helpful, but it might also be helpful to think about this in the context of other decisions that are made. For instance, whether or not that clinical significant threshold should be utilized in an essential medicine process that I introduced a bit earlier. So one thinking, one way to think about that. Great, and I'll see if there are any other involve more than one patient representative and quality improvement projects in general too. So yes, some better patient representation or people who are affected by the intervention in the various processes that we've laid out before may be extremely, extremely helpful. Okay, I'll go back to my presentation here, and I'll particularly will reflect on again what we've mostly talked about and what we think is an opportunity for clinical guidelines or health guidelines rather, health technology assessment and the related fields. And that is to start thinking about how these criteria are actually considered across disciplines, where evidence summaries can be shared from an HTA to a guideline. This was mentioned by several of you, but it can also be shared with those who develop quality improvement programs or schemes. It can be shared with those who make coverage decisions. As the criteria are similar for decisions, for instance, about what an essential medicine list is, there's no reason why a systematic review from an HTA or a guideline that describes these factors here couldn't be used by the essential medicine list decision makers or by those who develop health policy. Really no good reasons, right? If we were to work together on the questions. So if we work together on what are the relevant for a health system's patient population or patient populations or people who are affected by the interventions itself, the comparators, and in particular, as we mentioned, as the outcomes. Okay, so that really could advance this field if we also start, several of you mentioned terminology, if we start just thinking about what are alternative terms. Let's not get hung up on them. The criterion is the same. You might just use a different term, which we have as example, for instance, in the context of what ethics might be and under which criterion they might particularly fall. But this area of the work is definitely shareable, and the concepts such as what I presented, the hub and spoke model for outcome selection and definition would already help with that particular issue here, the benefits and harms and the values that might be associated with a particular intervention. Okay, so to sum it all up, I'm just going to provide you with my little summary. You've been very active in the chat, and I think that has provided extremely helpful insight into some of the issues that we've been addressing with this working group that I would like to thank again here. And it's too bad that the co-speakers couldn't be here today. It might have made for another voice, obviously. But what I did is I described the decision-making context in healthcare, that there's overlap of guidelines with the HTA and many other disciplines that we are trying to summarize under this unifying theory in order to facilitate interaction across these different fields, sharing of information. We presented a framework for thinking and working together. The outcomes were one example that obviously is patient and people-centered that can be utilized. And I wanted to do one other thing. If you really feel like following up or providing any additional feedback beyond what you can do, obviously when this session is being closed, then use this link. I'm going to put it in the chat. Use this link and let us know whether or not you want to be involved in follow-up work that might evolve from the work that I described here with these various actors. So you can copy and paste this particular link. I'm going to leave it here for a second. You can copy and paste that link and sign up in this Google Sheet for follow-up and further information if you are interested. So easy enough. The way to do that is this way: copy, and paste. And what I will do is I will see if there are final comments. We have just a few minutes left. If there are any final comments from anybody who might want to pass this. Yeah, so the link is in the chat. You can just copy and paste it here. You can see my screen. You just copy and paste this into a browser, and you get this, and you can leave me with your name, and we will follow up with you. Yeah. All right. I'll leave that here for a second. I looked. It has been in the Q&A already, but I will do that again. Okay. It might just take a second for you to come up, Yasser. So should be here. It's in the live Q&A. So yeah. Okay. View only shouldn't be view only. I will definitely. Yeah. Okay, I will adjust this. Everybody should be able to sign up. Okay, good. But thanks, Therese. I will definitely be in touch with you, and I will now put in my chat my email address that you can utilize to contact me as we are ending this session. Thank you, Yasser, very much for the comment. Thanks, Therese. So that's great. If there are further comments, you can leave them in the chat. And I'll stay on for another minute. Thanks, everybody, for being so attentive here. Yeah, I will do that. Please copy and paste that link. Should have been editable, but apparently it's not. So we will change this. I should be able to change it in the Okay, that's done. Thank you so much. Thanks, Karen. So it should work now if you wanted to sign up. I'll leave the link there. You have it in your browser, so it should be working. Thanks, Karen, for letting me know that this was not set up as a shareable link. Okay. Well, I'm glad that I stayed on time. Few sessions end a few seconds early. As I said, I will stay here and look for any further comments. Great. I see people are entering their name. Great. Okay, it seems to be working. Okay, thanks everybody. Go back to your rooms. I'm seeing from Francois, there's still a few people here. I'm seeing from Francois that we can go over a few minutes, but I don't think we want to. I'm just here in case that there are any questions and for people to be able to enter their information in that spreadsheet, which is superb, very much appreciated.
Yeah, Olga, just to point out at this stage, because the live is over, the live Q&A is disabled by the portal, but they could obviously still use, yeah, your link and put your name on your shared document, of course, yeah. But you should not use the portal because they're not going to be able to.
Okay, yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, I should have known that, but I did not. We'll keep it open on the Zoom. Perfect. It's been a real pleasure. I will now drop off. I think it's like Philip Dahm always says, the popcorn analogy. Things are dropping off, but I see that people are entering their names in the spreadsheet. Excellent. Thanks so much. Okay. Bye and have great fun, everybody, with the rest of the GIN meeting.